We need to officially transition from George to Mr. Paul McCartney. Now, as I said, I first heard the Beatles as a child, and the first thing I heard was the Sgt. Pepper album because my uncle was a hippie and he gave it to my mom. He thought every adult should have it. So, I was in kindergarten or first grade, and of all the myriad different sounds on that album, one of the things that really gripped me right from the beginning was Paul McCartney's singing voice. I was really drawn to it on all the things he does on Pepper. And likewise, his voice is a real asset to the White Album. These days, people talk about maybe his voice, he's aging and everything, it's inevitable. But he was definitely in his prime in these days. Of the 30 songs on the album, 11 of them, are sort of Paul-led. He's the lead singer. The song Junk, which there's a Esher demo of, as people may know, he sort of had it floating around during this. He sort of had it floating around during the Let It Be, and nobody was really wanting to do it, and it didn't even make it on Abbey Road. It finally surfaced on his first solo album. On the Esher demos, when John has Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam, there's no She Came In Through the Bathroom Window yet. So pretty much, as far as we know, anything Paul thought of made it on the album.
It's interesting that you say that, whatever Paul thought of made it to the album. That was part of how I went about. I mean, we might as well get into this. At the beginning of November, I was part of an international academic symposium at Monmouth University, and the whole weekend was dedicated to the 50th anniversary of the White Album. And we're talking about the Esher demos as well. My performance and presentation was selections from the Esher demos performed live. And I had to look at it, and I looked at it. I mean, I was just doing like a gig as a set. It was, it was the entertainment for the Thursday night at the conference dinner for all the attendees. But I looked at it, as aside from it being just a normal set, like any gig that I would do, I also looked at it like from a presentation standpoint, where I had to look and say, okay, I'm only going to do 9 songs, so I only have so much time. So let me do 3 from George, 3 from John, 3 from Paul, because there were no Esher demos for Ringo. And the thing that I noticed was the Paul songs, there's not much difference from the Esher demo of the song to the final version of the song.
Yeah, great point.
The Esher demo of Blackbird, had it been a cleaner recording, could have been used as the final master.
Right.
Now, John had a bunch of stuff and George's stuff went through permutations, which we kind of touched upon earlier, and he changed a lot of stuff from going from the demo to the recording to the final recording, and had a couple of songs removed. And John had a lot of stuff. John did a few things that were completely scrapped from the final album.
True.
Paul went into the demos with I think the finished product in his head. To his credit and to his detriment, he's always been like that.
Won't let anybody see it until he feels like it's pretty much done.
Right. You mentioned Paul's voice being an asset. Absolutely. Paul is 5 different lead singers in one guy.
Exactly, yeah, as we'll hear. But, interestingly, George Harrison, when he was demoing All Things Must Pass for Phil Spector, he was saying, like, okay, Phil, this one isn't really done yet. Still need a few more words. You're right. George and John were less shy about sharing things that were in progress, where Paul seemed to be like, more meticulous. Like, I'm not going to, maybe it's the thing, because I've worked with guys like this before. He thought if he had an empty verse or an empty thing, they would jump in and throw something in, and he wouldn't be able to do anything better, and it would stick in his craw that they had filled in the gap.
I can see that. You know what? With Paul's personality, I can definitely see that.
One thing about John and Paul, they had a little battle going back to the very beginning about album openers and album closers. Were we going to close the album with Young singing Money? Or we're going to open with I Saw Her Standing There? So it's sort of significant that the entire White Album starts off with a Paul McCartney composition back in the USSR. I'm sure a lot of that was because it's really high energy. I'm sure a lot of that was because they're trying to say, this ain't Pepper, everybody. And hey, we can still rock. And interestingly, famously, this is what they worked on when Ringo was absent for a while. So not only is Ringo not drumming on it, but Paul, John, and George are all credited as drummers on it.
I think the reason that all 3 are credited as drummers on the track is I think like they might have overdubbed a snare. I mean, if you want to get, at the end of A Day in the Life, all 4 of them are playing piano.
Right. You could credit them all as piano players, right?
Yeah. So, but I think it's a great way to open the album. And oddly enough, if you look at it, both albums start with a Paul song and end with a John song.
Yeah, that's a good point. I remember I saw Paul live when he did the Back in the U.S. tour, 2002, let's say. and the Rusty Anderson version of the band. And when they did Back in the USSR, man, it had impact. It was so fresh. It was like it could have been written that week. It was like a rock and roll powerhouse, and they had all the visuals, the screens going, and it was just really kick-ass. So yeah, that was one of the highlights of that concert for me. People equate it with the Beach Boys. It actually kind of starts with Chuck Berry, because Chuck Berry had the song "Back in the USA."
Back in the USA, yeah.
And
Sorry.
then
Yeah.
Mike Love is in India, and Paul says, "Hey, I think this is kind of like a Beach Boys type thing," because really the Beach Boys was the four freshmen on top of Chuck Berry. It's basically four freshman harmonies over Chuck Berry rhythms. And Mike Love said, "Well, hey, if you really want to make it like a Beach Boys song, you should talk about all the different kind of girls, go around the Soviet Union." So there was all that. But in the book, there's a little bit of a revelation that in Paul's mind, this guy was a spy returning from America to Russia. And that's kind of a little twist I hadn't thought of. I've got to wonder, though, the feasibility of a flight in 1968 from Miami, Florida to Russia, via BOAC, now known as British Airways. I don't know if that was just a little flight of fancy. Of course, the Beatles performed in Ed Sullivan in Miami, so there was that. But I got to wonder, flew in from Miami Beach to Russia. I don't know if that was actually possible in those days.
Poetic license.
Right, exactly. So everybody has to agree that, musically it's great. I've got to wonder what Ringo thinks, though, because, he wasn't in on it. Of course, ironically, speaking of the Beach Boys, I think sometime in the 80s, might have been the 90s, I'm pretty sure it was the 80s, the Beach Boys are performing live. Ringo sits in with them, and the song they all play together is Back in the USSR, because it has the ooh, ooh, it seems like a good fit for the Beach Boys. Ringo's probably thinking, I wonder if these guys know.
It's so funny that you mentioned that, because I was thinking that same thing, and I can tell you where I first heard that. I was just getting into the Beatles in the mid to late 80s, and somebody let me borrow a vinyl bootleg on the Sapcore label, and it was called The Little Red Album. And the opening track was the Beach Boys live with Ringo Starr doing Back in the USSR.
Yeah, well, it did happen. I've seen video of it.
I want to point something. I wanted to comment on something you mentioned.
Sure.
You talked about seeing Paul in 2002 and how fresh Back in the USSR sounded.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you a question. Can you find me any song on the White Album that today doesn't sound fresh? That's the beauty and the genius of the Beatles.
Well, I think a big reason for what you're saying is the Beatles were always leaders. They were never followers. They were always trying to be different than everybody else, cutting edge, ahead of the curve. And as you also pointed out, the team around them was recording everything really well. Imagine if they did these amazing performances and it just wasn't captured, because, that first album they did, Please Please Me, they just did their live set. They all performed together, set up some room mics and shared mics and maybe one or two on the kit. And so you get the energy and you get the impact, but you don't get the detail that you got, when they had 8-track recorders, in 69 and everything. So there's that factor too. I catch your point about, everything, because, he did Blackbird at that same show. But I'm just saying is, they played that song, it wasn't like when they do All My Lovin' or something, it's kind of, touching nostalgia, 64 itself. It was kind of like, wow, this song just kicks butt today.
Right. Yeah, I got you.
There's another performance I wasn't at personally, but I've seen a video of Paul and the band, after Glasnost and sort of opening of restrictions. Paul took his band to Moscow and performed Back in the USSR in the USSR. You could tell that was quite an emotional moment, but it was particularly touching, even though it's not like a slow touching song like Here Today or something, to see him do Back in the USSR, the Georgia Girls and the this and that. They knew enough English to know that was about them, and that was their tie to this juggernaut of Western music. That was their claim to fame, so to speak. So that was a really cool moment, I felt. But the other thing I want to say about Back in the USSR is, in a way, it makes a statement, but in a way, it's false advertising, because it is really not an accurate indication of the material that's going to follow. In fact, as Paul said in that quote that you're tired of, all the variety and the fact that it is 30 songs on a double album is one of the things that's so cool. You just don't know what you're going to get. So let's go to Obla-Di Obla-Da. Interestingly, Obla-Di Obla-Da, Life Goes On, Bra. I didn't really know what bra meant. I didn't realize some people use it in the sense of brother. Like in Hawaii,
Yeah,
they go, "Yo,
yeah,
bra."
life goes on, brah.
Yeah, life goes on, brother. But I would say that, you talked about the anthology version earlier. That was one of the kind of cool things for me about anthology. Obla Di Bla Da has never been one of my favorite Beatles songs by far. But the version on anthology was so different. It was so kind of cool to hear not something stripped down or bare, but an actual sort of band performance that was different than what you're used to. In their mind, this was, Caribbean ska, which they'd taken a crack at on I Call Your Name. Reportedly, John Lennon was really burned out on the song. It's another one they did a million times and really hated it in the end. I have a buddy named Dave, and he used to say that when we were talking about the difference between John and Paul, he goes, "Yeah, Paul McCartney would write those songs that just made you want to skip down the street." And when he used that expression, skip down the street, I thought, Desmond. That is the type of song.
All right, I'm gonna put in a shameless plug for a dear friend, my friend Kit O'Toole,
Yeah.
who has an amazing column called Deep Beatles.
Yeah.
Kit O'Toole did a great presentation all about Obla Di Obla Da and the origins of ska, and how reggae and ska came to the UK, and touched upon the reggae roots and the blue beat roots of the song. And one of the things she mentioned was that Paul had a friend. They knew a guy named Jimmy Scott. Jimmy Scott used to have this expression, obla di obla da, life goes on, brah. And Paul nicked it and actually wrote Jimmy a check.
Yeah, that's kind of cool.
Because hey, we're using this phrase of yours in a song, so.
And with Obla Di Obla Da, we were talking before about happy accidents and like the wine bottle and different things that happen. And interesting thing happened with this is Paul misspoke during one of the vocal takes, and he said Desmond stays at home and does his pretty face, adding a whole sexual ambiguity thing that was never originally intended. But then again, you think about it. What's one of the songs in the Esher demos? It's Polythene Pam, who's so good looking that she looks like a man. And, and you got to wonder if at least at some level that's in Paul's subconscious,
It's interesting because another presentation at the symposium, we were talking about that song, and specifically that line. And this I wish I could remember the gentleman's name. I feel bad that I can't. But he talked about that song and talked about the characters of who Desmond and Molly Jones are.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they were a gay couple, or a gay man and a gay woman posing as a straight couple. And it was interesting.
Yeah.
But deep down, I think, Paul just flubbed it, and they were he goes,
Yeah.
It's good enough. It sounds good. I'm going to keep it in.
I think it was a mistake, and they left it in, and then it just took on a whole new context.
Interestingly enough, though, that mistake has taken on a life of its own, because there's been a few covers of that song, and they leave that mistake in.
Oh yeah, that's how the song goes. And let's not forget that arguably the fifth Beatle was Brian Epstein, and the Beatles were well aware of his sexuality. So in a way, you could say that the Beatles' career was made by homosexual lust.
I wouldn't disagree with that. Oh, one other thing. We were talking about Anthology 3, and we're talking about how, back at the beginning of the show, we talked about how this box set really is value for the money. The early version of Obla Di Obla Da appears on Anthology 3.
Yep.
It's the same take as the one that's on this box set, but the box set is minus the horn overdubs.
Okay.
So it's an earlier mix. So you get the same take, but it doesn't have the horns.
And as I said earlier, you could tell that they were conscious of that when they did this. So anytime you see anything that appears to be redundant, they do something. I'm glad you brought that up, because it illustrates what I said earlier, more specific terms. They said, well, they already got this. What if we pull this off or add this on or give them another, another minute and a half of Los Paranoias? So, there's some crossover, but there's also, they know people own Anthology 3 is what I'm saying.
Right, and they also know that the majority of the people who are going to spend the money on the Super Deluxe also own the bootlegs, and God love them for that.
Yeah, and how many bands are people still interested in 50 years after the fact? It's a pretty small group. Well, we have to move on to Wild Honey Pie.
You know what? We can keep moving on past it.
I'm glad you say that, because in the entire Beatle canon, I don't want to say worst, I'll have to say least favorite, because it's a subjective thing. I can summarize this song in one word: pointless. What is this doing on this masterpiece album? Musically, lyrically, performance, I'm going, what is this piece of crap? Now, I love the Beatles. Beatles can quote unquote do no wrong, but
They did some wrong once in a while. Thankfully, it's short enough that it really doesn't have an impact.
well, my point is, George has got some great songs sitting on the sidelines, and the album comes out and he has to suck it up that Wild Honey Pie. And not only that, just to add to the confusion, there's already a song called Honey Pie later on the album. So I don't know. Not just my least favorite thing on the White Album, my least favorite thing the Beatles have ever done, going back to home recordings in the 1950s. I'm glad you more or less agree with me about that.
He could have saved Wild Honey Pie for Wildlife.
Yeah, it might have fit there. But can you imagine someone saying that this is their favorite Beatles song, and would you want to meet that person?
I think I have.
Oh.
I'm not. I probably, what, knowing some of the Beatle people I've met over the years, I probably have met somebody who would be crazy enough to admit that Wild Honey Pie is a favorite.
Don't Pass Me By is looking pretty good right now.
No.
Compared to that, it is. I mean, I think what does it for me is the vocals. It's like, Paul, you're a brilliant singer. Why are you making us listen to this? This is only 53 seconds long, so you can't put a full George track in there. But as Paul said, it is what it is. Warts and all, so be it. But we will do what Scott said earlier, and we'll move on to Martha, My Dear. I know people are sort of split on this one, too, which is kind of surprising to me because it's pretty complex musically. This is another song on the album that has a classical influence in that Paul consciously tried to have his hands do two different things, two different parts at once, like if you're playing a Bach two-part invention. So it's a little more complex on the piano than he usually does. This is another thing that was recorded at Trident, not EMI. John is not on the track. Paul is not a trained writer in a sense, and I always like the unusual chord progression of Martha, My Dear. He does certain things that other people probably wouldn't think to do. Martha, My Dear is a good example of that for me, the way the melody just keeps sort of opening up. A large complement of outside musicians, both strings and brass. Probably not my favorite White Album song, but I won't skip it. I mean, I think it's cool.
Beautiful melody, really, really beautiful piano part. It's one of those that John would consider granny music because the middle eight's got that kind of oompa section.
Yeah.
But I dig it.
And Paul has alternately said that the lyrics were and were not about his dog of the same name. One time he just flat out said, yeah, it's me singing to my dog. Another time he's going, nah, I just used the name Martha because it sounded pretty, sort of like the Hey Jude, Hey Jules, fictionalizing something that started real. I don't think it really matters at this point to me if he's singing to a dog or someone else. It's really just about the sound, and I think it's cool. I mean, I like it. I certainly like it head and shoulders above Wild Honey Pie.
I think Martha, My Dear is one of the top two most beautiful songs written about a dog.
So Blackbird, another sort of classical influence, Paul himself has said that, is based on a Bach bourrée. And then lyrically influenced by the civil rights movement, again, as we spoke about, a song of its time. Very stripped down. No other Beatles, just Paul, similar to Yesterday, but this time, no string arrangement. Just Paul's voice, his guitar. What I always thought was a metronome, but it turns out it's just Paul tapping his foot. They couldn't resist going into the sound effects and getting some bird sound. As Paul describes it, another variation on Take a Sad Song and Make It Better, apparently for the black women in the United States, a little bit of encouragement. This is a song that is one of his better known ones, but the point being, we spoke earlier about them considering this their follow-up to Pepper. A song like Blackbird, or at least a recording or a presentation like this, would have never shown up on Pepper. It didn't have the complexity and the polish. It was too simple, but it fits nicely on the White Album, so it shows that they pivoted intelligently.
I've heard stories that, because Blackbird apparently was written in Rishikesh, and so I've heard, there was a blackbird sitting in a tree, singing its Blackbird song, and that inspired Paul to write the song. And then in recent years has said it was about the civil rights movement.
Right.
But there's also a bootleg recording of Paul and Donovan from the Postcard, the Mary Hopkin album sessions.
Yep.
And Paul is talking about Blackbird, talking about the song with Donovan, saying he played it for Diana Ross and she took offense to it.
Oh.
So who knows what the real story is.
Well, also, some things are subconscious, too, because somebody pointed out to Paul that the song Yesterday, why she had to go, I don't know, it was about his mother dying. And he hadn't thought of that when he wrote it. He thought, oh, maybe it is, So Sometimes even the writer doesn't know. But it's interesting to mention that this wasn't just a given. Paul, John Lennon, and George Martin did have a discussion about whether to embellish or not to embellish Blackbird. I mean, George Martin said, well, maybe at this point you should bring something in. And so John was there, but didn't sing on it or play on it. George and Ringo were out of the country. They were in California at the time. Right. Speaking of songs from India, let's roll into an interesting one, Rocky Raccoon. You know, we mentioned Danville, Pennsylvania. In his lyrics, Paul uses all three variations of my name. He uses Dan, Danny, and Daniel.
Now I'm going to think of you every time I cover that song.
That's it, man. Well, as you should. But, you know, you listen to the intro of that, and this was another sort of revelation from Anthology, when that Somewhere in the Black Mountain Hills of Dakota. And then, you know, he used, I think, Minnesota in
Rocky Raccoon.
Right.
Was a fool unto himself.
There's that too. It just goes to show that it seems like he was just like doing a stream of consciousness, and the one we got about the Black Mountain Hills of Dakota, it could have been a different take. It could have been a different state. It was just sort of the vibe. I
like the tune. I always get the vibe of like he's watching an old Western. It's, you know, I picture a little movie in my head, cowboy in a shootout, you know, and Rocky loses.
Yeah, he loses, right.
The song does not have a happy ending.
No, that's one thing that's cool about it, because it has a happy vibe. It's going against type. But what I learned from the book is that it was originally Rocky Sassoon, John, Paul, and Donovan in India, just sort of, you know, hanging out, just jamming on it. And it changed from Rocky Sassoon to Rocky Raccoon as a reference to like a Davy Crockett-style coonskin cap.
Right. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And, you know, John and George are both credited on bass on that one. So it looks like Paul was focusing on his acoustic guitar, his lead vocal. Also, interesting to note, I think most people know that the honky-tonk piano was George Martin, but the harmonica and accordion were both John Lennon. People may not know that. And let's roll on to the next Paul song.
I love Why Don't We Do It in the Road, but what is there to say? It's Paul doing everything. One kind of cool point that I noticed with the song, if you listen to it, especially in demo form, he starts off kind of mellow, then gets a little harder, and then finally he's like balls out screaming on the last turnaround.
Yeah, it's much better than Wild Honey Pie. I mean, Paul does everything on it but the drums. This time Ringo did play some drums. In fact, he played while Paul played bass. There's no John and there's no George. One reason it's better than Wild Honey Pie is because Why Don't We Do It in the Road is a pretty memorable and compelling phrase. It makes you think of public sex. You know, it's, you know, it gets your attention, you know.
Right.
I just think it sounds like the germ of an idea that wasn't really fleshed out the way it could have been. And I think this is a song that really would have benefited from some participation from John. What Ringo said about it was the fact that John and George were on it. He goes, look, you know, only 16 tracks on the White Album had all four of us. You know, 14 didn't. So, you know, we really weren't worried about who was there and who wasn't. Whether that's true or not, I just heard that John himself was disappointed that this sort of Lennon-esque track was done without his input. Particularly if you think about it, it's credited as Lennon-McCartney. So I get the feeling that, as Paul has mentioned before, he was the bachelor. He wasn't going home to a wife and kids, and he lived around the corner in St. John's Wood. I got to believe a lot of the time, he's like, look, you know, the session's over, there's some time, no one else is here. He says that's kind of why he ended up directing more or less Magical Mystery Tour, you know. He was there more, and that's probably true. So I guess when I hear Why Don't We Do It in the Road, I like the groove better than Wild Honey Pie. I like the vocal performance much better, but I'm a little disappointed that it wasn't developed more. So why don't we move to the next song? I Will. Now, what he said, at least in the book, was, you know, back when the Beatles played in Hamburg, they couldn't only do rock and roll. People wanted to hear mambos and rumbas and sambas and bossa novas and stuff. And so they needed to have something with a little bit of that rhythm. So in his mind, that's kind of what this was meant to be. He said he didn't have words for it that he thought were suitable for a long time. He just had the music. For me, I have to say, in terms of I Will, I think the sound of it is beautiful. It's a great recording. His voice is great. The lyrics, to me, are a big weakness of the song. They're so generic, they sound like a Hallmark card to me. You love you forever and forever, love you with all my heart, love you whenever we're together, love you when we're apart. It works, but it's almost sort of like placeholder stuff. I mean, to me, it's almost like I love you on a boat, I love you with the goat, I love you in a box, I love you with a fox. It was like kind of like, come on, Paul. I mean, and he even said in the book, which I just recently read, that he had trouble finding something that fit. Even during the session, he'd go, step inside, love, Los Paranoias. He doesn't seem to even want to work on it. So I would say this is a case of me enjoying the recording, never turn it off if I hear it singing along, great melody. I just wish the words weren't so generic.
Paul has never really been given credit as a great wordsmith, and that's fine because with melodies like that, you don't have to. The melody, it's flawless, but the thing that I love about this song the most, and it's what I listened for, especially since it was pointed out to me just like over the last couple of years, there's no bass guitar on the song.
Yeah.
The bass line is Paul going boom, doom, 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 doom.
We had mentioned the Beatles being inventive and always trying something new. So when it came time for him to get his bass out, he said, well, let me just try this instead. Another thing they did one time and never again. Well, let's go on to another album opener that was, it was a band composition in a way, but it was Paul generated. Birthday. This is one of those things where if the girl can't help it hadn't been on TV that night, chances are the song would have never got written. Paul had mentioned in the early days when people in England, would get 45s from sailors, but there were really no movies or concerts or anything. They didn't really know what their heroes looked like. Here comes this movie with Eddie Cochran in it, with Gene Vincent, Little Richard, Fats Domino in full color, rocking out. So this really was a big deal for them. As people probably know, Eddie Cochran performs 20 Flight Rock in that movie, which was sort of Paul's audition piece the day he met John.
Yep.
John was impressed that Paul knew all the lyrics and could tune a guitar, apparently. But, those other guys, Little Richard, they covered Little Richard tunes, Long Tall Sally, Kansas City, Hey, Hey, Hey. Gene Vincent, the arrangement they did of Ain't She Sweet was Gene Vincent's. Lady Madonna was written in the style of Fats Domino, even though they didn't really cover a tune, although Paul did later, and John both, actually. Ain't that a shame?
And Fats covered Lady Madonna.
He did, that's right. So, they were all wound up from this movie. They wanted to rock. That's where the do-do-do-do-do-do-do comes from. But the word birthday, according to the book that accompanied Paul's, I don't remember it being anybody's birthday. It was more of a commercial motivation because they go, things that say Christmas and birthday in them sometimes, can take on a life. So it wasn't a reference to anything in the movie. I think it's an indication of how talented these guys are that in a single session, they conceived a song and completed it. They thought of the song, wrote the music, words, did all the tracking and everything, and at the end of that session had an album track. So Mother Nature's Son, this is another song that has India roots. The Maharishi gave a lecture about unifying man and nature. John wrote a song that was demoed at Esher, which was Child of Nature. Paul wrote Mother Nature's Son. That's basically a different way of saying the same thing. It looks like Paul went out, which is probably a good thing because, John reimagined it as Jealous Guy. Here again, sort of the country, really the folk genre. The influence of George Martin with the tasteful use of horns. You've got 2 trumpets and 2 trombones, which is a little bit unusual instrumentation to keep it from overpowering it. This one, Paul, instead of tapping his foot like on Blackbird, he tapped on a book, just sort of like in a Buddy Holly recording where they played on, boxes and road cases in your lap. You try different things. So he tapped on a book and they had to mic up the book.
Paul did some amazing, there's some really beautiful guitar playing by him on that. There's a second guitar part. It comes in toward the end of the song. That's a really beautiful counterpoint on the guitar. Unless you're really focusing on it, it just blends into the song so beautifully. But it's just my favorite guitar playing of Paul's is on that song.
I also think of Paul's Heart of the Country, one of my favorite songs on Ram. And he said, I grew up in this, port town, Liverpool, and you think it's industrial, but he goes, your English countryside was like a 5-minute bike ride. So he felt like there was some authenticity. But interesting, there again, just as with the movie, if the Maharishi wouldn't have gave that particular lecture, chances are neither of those songs, Child of Nature, a.k.a. Jealous Guy, or Mother Nature's Son, would ever exist. Our next Paul song, Helter Skelter. Think of the other songs he's done on this album. Blackbird, we just talked about Mother Nature's Son, I Will. And he has the versatility to do a crazy, wild, noisy song like this. This is another one where it's sort of lost in translation between the US and the UK because apparently it was a commonly known thing in the UK. Helter Skelter was a type of slide at a fairground.
Yep.
But in the U.S. it wasn't, so Helter Skelter just meant probably mayhem to us. Unfortunately for Paul, he sort of had a Jodie Foster, John Hinckley situation here, in that the Manson family decided Helter Skelter meant something. He didn't know who they were or what their deal was, and they've sort of been eternally connected, sadly for him. Just like the last thing Jodie Foster wants to talk about is somebody shooting the president to impress her. Not her choice, not her doing, but they're sort
Right.
of connected in history. So one thing that you learn, though, from the box set is they put a slapback echo on Paul's voice. And it reminded him of, Elvis and Buddy Holly, so he busted into Baby You're So Square. And with the old rockabilly thing, had a lot of slapback, not only on the voices, but the instruments.
Yeah, yeah.
Hold it, fellas.
Similar to the Let It Be sessions we were talking about before, where they recorded them, everything they did for a month, they would just go off, like George would start playing Hitchhike, or they'd play the Third Man theme, or anything to sort of distract them from what they were doing. Interestingly about Helter Skelter is that John and Paul swap roles. John is the bass player on Helter Skelter. Paul plays electric guitar, as does George Harrison, and it is a guitar player song, baby.
Oh, yes, it is.
Interestingly, something I didn't know, Mal Evans plays the trumpet at some point, and John Lennon plays saxophone. So those are probably just in the cacophony at some point. This is another one where there were some handwritten lyrics of Paul. He had written, when I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the hill, and I stop and I turn and I give you a thrill. So I'm glad he replaced that.
The inspiration for that song, aside from it just being about a slide, I've seen pictures of it. You walk in the door, you go up steps to the top of the thing, and you sit on like a burlap sack, and you slide down in a spiral. Mm-hmm. It's kind of cool. But the inspiration for the song was Paul had read an interview with Pete Townsend where Pete says, we've just written and recorded the loudest, nastiest track anybody's ever committed to tape. I think he was talking about I Can See for Miles. And Paul said, oh, really? And went in and created this insane rocker.
I don't think it's ever been confirmed that I Can See for Miles is the song. It's just everybody figured from the context, if it was The Who, that was sort of their latest thing. Of course, we mentioned earlier about Danville. I Can See for Miles and Miles, my last name Miles. So I've been hearing about that song quite a bit. But yeah, I would say that when I was that 14 or 15-year-old listening to the White Album for the first time, this is a track that was not on the Blue, and I'd never heard before. So it was similar to a friend of mine who played me like Black Dog by Led Zeppelin for the first time. It really blows your ears back. I mean, blows your hair back, blows all of you back when you just hear this, boom, down, 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 down. You go, what is this? And then it just builds from there. It starts out crazy and builds from there. Their guitars are barely in tune by the end of it. And I just love the wildness of it. But there again, to show the contrast in styles, what do we come out with next? Honey Pie. And you used the phrase earlier, granny songs. I mean, this is really the embodiment of it. Your Mother Should Know, When I'm 64, and then later, things like You Gave Me the Answer, sort of a Fred Astaire. This is the influence of Paul's father, who was a band leader, and Paul grew up with that kind of stuff. Personally, I like Paul's quote-unquote granny songs. I'm not put off by them at all. And upon first listen, I was impressed with this tune. I had no knowledge of 20s or 30s music at the time, or no knowledge of Paul's dad. But, the rhyming, the crazy, lazy, frantic, Atlantic, tragic, magic, even as a kid, I thought it was clever.
It's kind of Cole Porter-ish, isn't it? Lyrically.
It is. But also it's you became a legend on the silver screen, and the UK-US thing, I think is cool. Even more so maybe appropriate than the US Soviet thing.
I just realized, and this just popped into my head, this image that I get when I hear that song. My father was an oldies DJ, so I grew up on Elvis Presley and Little Richard and Fats Domino and Jerry Lee Lewis. But my dad was also a huge Laurel and Hardy fan. We had like 16 millimeter prints of film when I was a kid, and we used to watch a lot of Laurel and Hardy stuff. Whenever I hear Honey Pie, I picture Jean Harlow.
Okay, yeah, the platinum blonde, sure.
It's like Jean Harlow and Betty Boop. It's that kind of image that plays in my head to that song.
Yeah, me too. And don't forget, like, the new vaudeville band was around at this time with Winchester Cathedral.
Winchester Cathedral, yep, yeah.
Yeah, that was 66, actually. But, Paul would do this even in later years, as I said, with You Gave Me the Answer. And it's his right to do it. And you're right, it's the Cole Porter influence, for sure. But I want to point out that one of the things they've done in this box set is they sort of spotlighted George Martin's work with his horn arrangement to capture that feel. And people who don't know, the lead guitarist on that is John Lennon. It's not George.
Yep. John didn't do a lot of leads on the stuff, but the leads that he did play are pretty incredible. He plays the solo on You Can't Do That.
Right.
He plays the second solo on Long Tall Sally. When John pulled out his lead chops, dude did some pretty cool stuff.
Well, of course, there's the guitar battle on Abbey Road where they all three go around the circle. And don't forget, his guitar is his main instrument. He did some keyboard compositions, of course, Imagine and, Lucy in the Sky and things, but he is a guitar lover.
Yeah, the guitar battle, yeah. Paul, George, John, one measure each, around and around.
Yeah, it just goes to show, even at the end, no pun intended, they just had an endless ideas for arranging, going all the way back to the earliest. Even when there was just self-contained, it was what can we do as a group. They would have an arrangement idea to make every song a little different from every other song. It's just the fact that they were presented to the record label as a band with more than one lead singer. That alone was unusual. There's two tracks we need to talk about that are Paul tracks circa the White Album, some of his better known works, but they were singles and they weren't put on it. Lady Madonna, I think everybody knows that one. I won't go too deep into it other than, another one where they used horns, as you'd mentioned. To me, Got to Get You Into My Life was the first big splash of horns for me with the Beatles. But yeah, Savoy Truffle and Lady Madonna are a nice coupling, as you mentioned. And of course, the other one is Hey Jude, the monster hit of 1968. Big moment for Paul, a nice band performance. And, the whole backstory, I think that song is so famous. I think people know about, John and Cynthia getting divorced. Paul got to see Julian and etc. But, I don't really consider the Lady Madonna and Hey Jude White Album tracks other than they are sort of represented within this set, as is surprisingly Let It Be, although it is nothing like the Let It Be we all know. But as we'll get to later, I mentioned earlier about Paul and John both writing songs about nature, both writing songs about their childhood. Well, we have a situation where they both wrote songs about their mother.
Right. If we're talking about Hey Jude and where those songs fit, while they weren't on the album, they are represented on the box set, and they were part of that group of sessions that generated the White Album.
That's fair enough, yeah.
Remember, the Beatles' practice at that time was the single doesn't go on the album. We give our fans value for their money. We're not going to charge them for the same song twice.
However, also from these sessions, and not represented in the box set, Hey Bulldog. Probably because it's associated with Yellow Submarine. And the other Paul tune, it phrased the Esher demo of Junk.
Right.
So basically everything Paul that we're aware of presented made it on the album, except Junk. And Let It Be didn't make it on this, but obviously was the title track of a 1970 album. And of course, Hey Jude and Lady Madonna were huge hits.
At this point, you can't even consider Let It Be a song. It's just, It's a fragment of an idea. Right. that he's toying around with. For lack of a better term, it's there for shock value. It was a White Album session jam. It was just something to kill time during the While My Guitar Gently Weeps sessions.
It clearly wasn't a representation of what he wanted the song to be, although ironically at the end of it, George goes, "Oh, hey, mark that one. That's the keeper, everybody." And it's nothing like the Let It Be. I think you're right. I think they put it on there to surprise people that the sort of lineage of that song, which we associate much later, actually dated back to the White Album sessions.
There's something really cool if you've ever seen the DVD, The Beatles' First U.S. Visit, where they're in the hotel room in New York City or whatever, and John is messing around with a melodica, and he starts playing what becomes the opening bars of Strawberry Fields.
Right.
And that was 1964, so.
Yeah, well, hey, Don't Pass Me By. That one goes back.
Exactly. Yeah, but I would hardly consider "Don't Pass Me By" earth-shattering.
No, it's
like
right
Strawberry
up there.
Fields
it's
was.
right up there with Strawberry Fields, absolutely. And topping them all, Wild Honey Pie.